You're being dramatic, Mom. That's what my own daughter said to me flat and tired, like I'd asked her for the moon instead of just a little bit of her time. So I stopped. I stopped calling. I stopped trying. I stopped being anything to any of them at all. And what none of them knew was exactly how much they'd built their whole lives on without ever once realizing it. My name is Linda Foster. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in Kentucky my whole life out past Lexington and horse country, where the fences run for miles and everybody's got a story about somebody's granddaddy. Before I tell you what happened, I want to know where y'all are watching from tonight. Drop your city or state down in the comments. I always like knowing who's out there listening. Let me take you back to where all this started. I married my husband Roy when I was 20 years old, right at the little white church. My own mama got married in the same pews, the same worn wooden floor. Roy ran a small freight and trucking outfit he built up from a single beat-up flatbed truck he bought secondhand off a farmer down the road, working 7 days a week for the first 10 years just to keep it running. I ran a hair salon out of our converted garage for almost 30 years, cutting and setting the same women's hair every single week till I knew their whole lives better than my own, who was getting divorced, whose kid got into trouble, whose husband was drinking too much. We weren't wealthy people, not the way folks around here think of wealthy, but we were steady, and we were careful with what we had, squirreling away a little more every year than we ever spent. Roy used to tease me, sometimes half joking, in that dry way of his sitting out on the back porch with his evening coffee. Linda, don't you go bragging on what we've got tucked away. Money's got a way of turning even good kids strange. I'd laugh it off, tell him our kids weren't like that we'd raised them better than that. But I noticed even back then he never quite laughed along with me when he said it. Just went quiet a moment and went back to whatever he was fixing in the garage. We had 3 children. Renee was the oldest, sharp-tongued, even as a little girl, always the first to tell you exactly what she thought, whether you asked or not, the kind of child who corrected her teachers when she thought they were wrong. Mark came next, quiet, the kind of boy who'd rather disappear into his room than have a hard conversation, happiest with a wrench in his hand and nobody talking to him. And Julie, our baby, sweet as anything, the type who'd tell you she loved you 6 times in one phone call, and then somehow never quite show up when it mattered, all warmth and no follow-through even from the time she was small. I loved all 3 of them something fierce. Paid for their schooling, helped with their first homes, kept every one of my grandbabies at least one day a week without fail, packing lunches and driving carpools well into my 60s. Roy died on a Sunday morning nearly 10 years ago, out mowing the back pastures, same as he did every week. Massive heart attack, gone before the ambulance even made it down our long gravel drive. He was 66. The funeral filled up half our little church because Roy had hauled freight for half the farms in 3 counties over the years, always cutting somebody a deal when times got tight. That first year, my kids showed up good. Renee called most days. Mark came by to check the fences and the mower. Julie phoned every single morning, sweet as could be, telling me how much she loved me, how she didn't know what she'd do without me. I believed with my whole heart we'd hold together through the worst of it. If you've ever leaned on your children after losing everything else and slowly watched even that lean give way underneath you, I want to know. Tell me in the comments what that felt like for you. It helps me knowing I'm not the only one who's lived through it. Then the way these things always seem to go, it started slipping, and each one of my kids slipped away in their own particular fashion. Renee's calls thinned out fast and blunt, no real explanation, just less and less of her. Been swamped, Mom, we'll catch up soon, she'd say, and that soon kept sliding further out. Mark just went quiet altogether, texts instead of calls, sometimes days before he'd answer at all if he answered. Julie stayed sweet as sugar on every single call, always promising she'd visit that weekend, always somehow not making it, always with some soft, gentle excuse that left you feeling almost guilty for being disappointed in her. Year 2, I had a bad spell with my blood pressure dizzy enough that I had to sit down right there in the grocery store parking lot. Called Renee first from my car. She was blunt as ever. Mom, if it's serious, call 911, I'm at work. Called Mark. Straight to voicemail, no callback that whole evening. Called Julie last, and she gasped and fussed and told me she was coming right that minute. She didn't. Not that night, not the next day. I sat alone in my kitchen that whole evening, waiting on a daughter who meant every word she said and somehow never once acted on a single one of them. Year 3, my grandson Cody made varsity football first game of the season. Renee never mentioned it to me, at all, blunt silence being its own kind of answer. I found out from a neighbor whose grandson played on the same team. I drove out to that game anyway, sat up in the bleachers by myself, watched my own grandbaby play his heart out with nobody from my side of the family sitting beside me. Year 4 is the one that still catches in my chest, a little different than the rest. I had a small stroke, what they call a TIA, a warning sign, right there alone in my kitchen on an ordinary Thursday afternoon while I was drying dishes. Numbness down my whole left side, words coming out wrong when I tried calling for help, the phone nearly slipping right out of my hand. I managed to dial for the ambulance myself, and they kept me overnight in Lexington for observation, a machine beeping steady beside my bed the whole long night. From that hospital bed, I called all three of my children, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the phone steady against my ear. Mark didn't answer, same as always by then, and I'd stopped expecting him to. Julie called back 4 hours later, crying on the phone, swearing up and down she'd drive up first thing in the morning. She never came, not that week, not the next, though she texted twice to say she was thinking of me constantly. But it's Renee's response I still turn over in my mind some nights, more than the stroke itself even. She texted back one line quick and clipped the way she always was. Glad you're okay, Mom. Try not to make this a bigger deal than it is. I lay there in that hospital bed a long while after reading that, listening to the machines beep in the dark, watching the hallway light flicker under my door, feeling something in me go very quiet. If you've ever needed the people you raised to show up and gotten nothing but silence and excuses instead, I want to know how you got through it. And if this story's sitting right with you, don't go anywhere just yet, because we're only getting started on the part where everything changes. After that hospital stay, I started truly paying attention instead of quietly excusing every last one of them the way I'd been doing for years. When any of them did surface, their questions had a way of circling back to the same territory. Renee started asking blunt as ever whether I'd thought about downsizing now that I was on my own out there. Mark, in one of his rare longer texts, asked if I'd ever gotten Daddy's old life insurance sorted properly. Julie, sweet as sugar, kept bringing up how big the house must feel for just me, how nice it might be to simplify things. I realized slow and then sudden that our little farmhouse sitting on 12 acres that had tripled in value since horse country money started moving out this direction, along with what Roy had quietly built up in savings and investments over 40 years, made me worth considerably more than any of my three children ever fully understood. And the moment that understanding started dawning on them, even just a little, their occasional attention came wrapped tight around questions that had nothing to do with how I was actually holding up. Year 7, I called all three of them onto one line, a three-way call, because by then I knew better than to expect anybody driving out to see me for a conversation that wasn't strictly required. I told them plain that I was lonely, that I was getting older, that I needed to know I could count on at least one of them showing up when it truly mattered, not just when it happened to be convenient, my voice shaking a little as I said it out loud for the first time in 7 years. Mark stayed quiet the way he always did when things got uncomfortable, just breathing on the other end of the line. Julie made soft, sympathetic sounds down the line, sighing about how hard everything had been for everybody lately, how she wished things could be different. And Renee, blunt as she'd always been since she was a little girl, telling me exactly what she thought, whether I wanted to hear it or not, cut through the whole conversation with 4 words that have sat in my chest ever since, delivered flat and impatient like she was. Tired of a conversation we hadn't even really started having. You're being dramatic, Mom. 50 years of raising that girl, teaching her to read, sitting up with her through fevers and heartbreaks alike. And that's the sentence she reached for the very first time I asked her for something back. I didn't cry on that call. I sat in my kitchen a long while after I hung up, the same kitchen where Roy used to tease me about money changing good kids strange, and something in me went very still and very clear. If dramatic was what she thought this was, then dramatic was the last thing I intended to ever be around any of them again. Would y'all have stayed quiet on that call or said something right back to her? I'd love to know down in the comments. And if you've ever been told by your own child that your loneliness was just theatrics, hit that subscribe button, because what I decided to do about it next is going to make you sit up. I stopped calling. Stop texting. Stop showing up to birthdays uninvited. Stop sending the little cards and checks I used to slip in for the grandbabies. I simply went quiet, the way you'd close a door soft enough that nobody even notices it's shut until they go looking for it later. The following Monday, I drove into town and sat down with my attorney, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who'd handled Roy's estate all those years back when he first passed. I laid it all out for her: the hospital stay, Renee's text, that final call. Carol listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Linda, let's talk about what you actually want to leave behind instead of what they're already assuming they're entitled to. She came back to me 4 days later with the full numbers pulled together, and I remember her voice on that phone call had a different weight to it than I'd ever heard from her before. Linda, she said, between the land, Roy's investments, and the life insurance, you're sitting on right around $3.8 million. I sat down hard at my own kitchen table. Roy's little trucking company, in 40 years of careful saving, had turned into more than either of us ever imagined out loud to each other, let alone to our children. What none of them knew either was how much of that quiet money had already been flowing toward them for years without a single one of them ever once asking where it came from. Mark's truck repairs he could never quite afford on his own covered through what he assumed was some warranty program. Julie's husband's failed restaurant venture propped up more than once through a check she thought had come from her in-laws. Renee's daughter's braces paid in full and never once mentioned. Every one of them took what came their way and never thought to wonder why it kept coming or who it was truly costing. Over the following months, Carol and I restructured everything, meeting 5 separate times to go through every account and every possible way it could later be challenged, closing off each avenue methodically, the same way Carol had once handled every detail of Roy's estate. I removed all 3 of my children as primary beneficiaries of my will. Carol warned me they'd likely contest it. Let them, I told her. I've got years of unanswered calls and one very memorable text message that tell the real story better than I ever could. We split the 3.8 million a different way, entirely one that reflected who'd actually shown up in my life these past several years rather than who happened to share my last name. 35% went to the local volunteer fire department that had answered my call the night of my stroke faster than any of my own children ever did, arriving inside 8 minutes when it mattered most. 30% went to a scholarship fund at the community college for kids working their way through school the hard way, same as Roy and I once did, waiting tables and hauling freight to pay for night classes. 25% was placed in trust for my 6 grandchildren, held until each turned 28, with one clear condition attached: that they maintain a genuine documented relationship with me directly, not filtered through their parents, verified through Carol's office with logged visits and calls. The remaining 10% went to my neighbor Pauline, who'd driven me to every single follow-up appointment after my stroke without ever once being asked twice. The farmhouse and the 12 acres went into an irrevocable trust structure so that upon my death it would sell, and the proceeds would go exactly where I designated, with no path for my children to inherit it directly, no matter what story any lawyer tried telling a judge later on. For nearly a year I told my children nothing had changed, mostly because there was nothing left to tell. They weren't calling, so there was no conversation left to have. I started genuinely living instead of waiting around for a phone that wasn't going to ring. I joined a gardening club at the extension office. I started volunteering 2 mornings a week at the very fire department I'd named in my will. I made real friends, women who wanted my company because they actually enjoyed it, not because they were quietly circling something they hoped to inherit someday. Then, almost exactly 2 years after that call, everything shifted again. Julie called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday evening, her voice warm and sweet as it always used to be. "Mama, I've been thinking about you so much lately. We really ought to get together, don't you think?" I asked her plainly why now, after 2 years of near total silence. There was a long pause, and then it came tumbling out. Renee's husband worked with a fellow at the bank who'd mentioned in passing some unusual activity on an old joint account, and Mark had gone digging after that, piecing together that our little farmhouse property sitting right in the middle of expanding horse country was worth a whole lot more than any of them had ever bothered imagining. Suddenly, all 3 of my children remembered they had a mother. I didn't invite them out to the farmhouse. I wrote them each the same letter, instead certified mail, so there'd be no confusion later about what had or hadn't been said. I told them the truth plainly. I told them about the hospital bed, about Renee's exact words, about the years of silence that followed them. I told them the money was never a secret meant to punish them, only a life Roy and I built quietly and never wanted them depending on. I told them I'd heard your being dramatic loud and clear, and I'd simply decided to stop giving them anything left to call dramatic at all. Renee called the second she got that letter, and for the first time in years I heard something crack in that blunt voice of hers. "Mom, I didn't mean it like that." I told her calmly that meaning something one way and saying it plainly out loud into your own mother's ear are 2 very different things, and I'd had 2 long years to sit with the second one. Mark sent one short text. "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have called more." It was the most words he'd strung together for me in over a decade. Julie sent a long, tearful voicemail about how she'd always loved me more than anything, how she never meant for time to slip away like that, sweet as ever, and just as short on anything I could actually lean on. It's been 10 months since that letter went out. Mark and I talk now, short calls, awkward sometimes, but real, and he's driven out twice just to check the fences the way his daddy used to know us involved. Renee and I are still finding our footing, careful conversations that might someday turn into something honest again. Julie still calls sweet as sugar every week or 2, still promises visits that come maybe half the time now instead of never, which I suppose counts as progress of a kind, even if it's not the kind I once hoped for. I won't tell you this ends with everybody gathered back around my table like nothing ever happened, because it doesn't, and I've promised myself I'll only ever tell you the truth in these stories. Some days I still grieve the family I thought I had for so many years, the one I spent decades building meal by meal, carpool by carpool, one Sunday supper at a time. Most days I'm simply grateful for the life I've built since that phone call Pauline on my porch most mornings with her coffee going cold while we talk the fire department boys who wave every single time I drive by my gardening club that shows up rain or shine, women who genuinely enjoy sitting with me instead of quietly waiting on something. I gave my children everything I had for decades, every carpool, every dollar I could spare, every ounce of patience I had left in me. And when I finally asked for even a sliver of that back, I was told I was being dramatic. So I stopped being anything at all to any of them. And in doing that, I finally became something real to myself again, maybe for the first time in longer than I'd like to admit. I still haven't decided how far I'm willing to let any of them back in, if I'm honest with you. But I imagine when I do finally make up my mind, y'all will be the first to hear it long before my own children do. I'm Linda Foster. I'm 72 years old, and after my daughter called me dramatic, I stopped being anything to them at all and started being everything to myself instead.